The Prime Minister has ordered a wide-ranging inquiry into the use of contaminated blood products in the NHS, which has led to the deaths of nearly 2,500 people who were exposed to hepatitis C and HIV. The Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, who spent many years campaigning on the issue, said he had no doubt there had been a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. Theresa May has announced that she's launching a wide-ranging inquiry into the health service's use of contaminated blood products, which resulted in the deaths of 2,400 people. During the 1970s and 80s, many thousands of people were infected with diseases including HIV and hepatitis, in what one campaigner described as one of the worst peacetime disasters. Victims of the scandal claim there's evidence that officials tried to cover up the problems, and the government has warned that there could be criminal charges as a result of the inquiry. Our first report tonight is from our health editor, Hugh.
It's been called the worst disaster in the history of the NHS. Patients trusted the service to deliver safe treatment, including haemophiliacs needing blood clotting agents. But in the 1970s and 1980s, they were given a product called Factor VIII made from donated blood. Some of it came from prison inmates in the US who sold their blood, some of which was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. Andy Evans is chairman of the Tainted Blood campaign and has been campaigning for an inquiry for the last 20 years.
I was infected with both HIV and hepatitis B and C at the age of 5 years old. I'm 40 now, so I've lived for most of my life with these infections. I was given a diagnosis of full-blown AIDS when I was 16, before any effective treatment came out. Luckily, I was one of the lucky ones. I managed to survive that until treatment did come out, but it's obviously had a terrible, terrible impact on my life.
A Scottish inquiry by a Judge Lord Penrose was dismissed by victims as a waste of time when it reported in 2011. Its main recommendation was an HIV test for all those who'd had a blood transfusion before September 1991. An earlier inquiry in England was privately funded with no official status. Today, the Labour MP Diana Johnson, who's long campaigned on the issue, told the Commons it was the country's worst ever peacetime disaster and successive governments had failed to respond adequately.
Had more than 2,400 people died over the course of one day or 1 year, it would have been inconceivable for any government to refuse calls for a public inquiry. Yet the devastation caused by the contaminated blood scandal has been spread not over days or years, but over several decades.
Ministers made clear they were setting up the new inquiry after allegations of criminality had emerged, including tampering with medical documents. The Prime Minister's spokesman said there would be consultation on whether there'd be a Hillsborough-style independent panel or a judge-led inquiry.
Pressure has been building for an inquiry, with the leaders of 6 political parties, including Labour and the DUP, recently signing a letter to the Prime Minister saying the victims had a right to know what went wrong. It's been alleged that medical details were tampered with and some documents were destroyed as part of a cover-up. Here's our correspondent, Wira Davis.
Victims' relatives and their supporters say patients were treated like guinea pigs and that tests on people who'd been given contaminated blood were sometimes carried out without their knowledge or consent. Comparing what happened to the alleged cover-up after the Hillsborough football disaster, some campaigners say there were staggering levels of negligence from public bodies and there was an orchestrated campaign to prevent the truth being told. Andy Burnham, who's now the Mayor of Manchester and is a former Health Secretary, says what happened to the thousands of victims was a deliberate criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. He's among the many campaigners who say the terms of the inquiry should be broad enough to cover the possibility of criminal prosecutions.
I have evidence that medical records were falsified to distract people from the negligence. I have evidence that tests for hepatitis C and HIV were conducted upon people without their knowledge or consent. How can that be right? I also have evidence that the results of those tests were withheld, even when they confirmed a positive diagnosis. And people were subsequently then infected as a result of the withholding of that information. So, this is outrageous on every level.
David, now Lord Owen, was Health Secretary in the mid-1970s, when he says some officials were deliberately obstructive even as concerns about contaminated blood came to light. He's pleased but intrigued why the government has acted so decisively now.
They may well have evidence. After all, we know that 300 people have got together and have brought a case, and government have probably seen some of these documents, and they may find in that documents one or two very troubling things. I don't know. But something has triggered this after all these years of refusing to have an inquiry.
The government says the decision to hold an inquiry was taken after the emergence of new evidence. One campaigner used Freedom of Information requests to search official records and is reported to have found evidence that officials in the 1980s were told by American experts that blood products being imported from there came from unreliable and unsafe sources. What happened, says one government spokesperson, was nothing short of a scandal, and this would have to be a wide-ranging inquiry.